Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week, we'll be doing another feed drop from Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast. I hope you enjoy. Hello and welcome to Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast. Today, we'll be discussing a very recent and very tragic event in Japanese history, the 3/11 Fukushima disaster. This disaster and the aftermath still resonate even to this very day, both inside and outside of Japan. The story of the disaster is the intersection of several important narratives, such as the role of public utility companies in Japan in the 21st century, the intense and fraught debates over nuclear power in post-war Japan, and the actions of so many brave and compassionate people who helped mitigate the disaster, either by saving people, entering the reactors to prevent total meltdown, assisting with evacuation, assisting with relief supply delivery, and more. What's most important is that the story is still unfolding to this day. On a regular basis, irradiated water is released into the Pacific Ocean. Additionally, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant is still being decommissioned, and will take 30 to 40 more years to be fully decommissioned. Also, in light of the event, public opinion against nuclear energy reached new highs among citizens and politicians alike, but is actually starting to come back around. For this episode, we'll first establish a timeline of the earthquake, the resultant tsunami, and the nuclear accident. Next, we'll talk about the aftermath and some of the ramifications of the incident. Finally, we'll jump into some discussion of the issue of nuclear power in the 21st century, disaster preparedness, and Tokyo Electric Power Company, or TEPCO's, complicated role in the whole thing. So, let's begin. On March 11th, 2011, at 1446 Japan Standard Time, one of the strongest earthquakes in recorded history, and the strongest earthquake in Japanese history, was recorded 72 kilometers or 45 miles to the east of the Oshika Peninsula in Fukushima Prefecture. At the time, the magnitude was recorded at a 9 and then revised many months later to a 9.1. The shaking lasted for about 6 minutes. This earthquake would come to be named the Higashi Nihon Daishinsai, or the Great East Japan Earthquake. This earthquake was what is called an undersea megathrust earthquake, which basically means that one of Earth's tectonic plates is forced underneath another in one elongated shift. This earthquake was preceded by increased seismic activity in the area for a while prior. For example, there was a foreshock, like an aftershock but before the earthquake instead of after, which was recorded on March 9th, and it was a magnitude of 7. Then, on March 11th, before the big earthquake, there were several foreshocks, all in the range of magnitude 6. After the earthquake, there were hundreds of recorded aftershocks. This was such an enormous shift that there were even aftershocks that occurred years after the fact. There was a 7.1 magnitude aftershock in 2013, 2 years later. It was such a large earthquake that it changed the very geography of the Earth. The earthquake moved the island of Honshu 2.4 meters, or 8 feet, eastward, and shifted the Earth on its axis by estimates of between 10 and 25 centimeters, or 4 and 10 inches. These changes caused the speed of the Earth's rotation to increase, shortening the day worldwide by 1.8 microseconds due to the redistribution of Earth's mass. In megathrust earthquakes, there's often land subsidence, which is where the elevation of a patch of land decreases, or the level of that land moves downward. Several cities in the Iwate, Miyagi, and Fukushima prefectures saw as much as 3 feet 11 inches of land subsidence, which is permanent. The earthquake was initially reported as a 7.9 magnitude by the USGS, but it was quickly revised to a 9 on the day of, and then 9.1 much later after research was carried out. The quake caused a 20 to 25 foot upthrust along a 180 kilometer or 110 mile wide seabed, causing a major tsunami. The tsunami took between 10 and 30 minutes to reach the coast after the earthquake, and it ravaged the east coast of northern Japan. It propagated across the Pacific as well, as far as Alaska, British Columbia, and the west coasts of the US and South America. It even went so far as to cause what is called Seiche waves in Norway, which is where seawater appears to boil and seethe and roll onto shore, not in waves, but as though a pot were overflowing with water. At 15:55 Japan Standard Time, the tsunami hit Sendai Airport, completely flooding it and sweeping away cars and airplanes along the way. This tsunami was huge. 13-foot tsunami waves were recorded in Iwate Prefecture. Several seawalls up and down the coast failed because of the size of the surge. Most people who were killed or injured on March 11th were killed or injured in the flooding. The official figures released in 2021 reported 19,759 deaths, 6,242 injured, and 2,553 people missing. 90% of the deaths, or 14,300 of them, were caused by drowning. An estimated 5 million metric tons of debris and waste were produced, with some of it even washing up on the west coast of the United States months later. All of Japan's seaports were shut down for a while. Around 4.4 million households served by the Tōhoku Electric Power Company in northeastern Japan were left without electricity, and 1.4 million without water. Transport infrastructure also broke down, with considerable damage to roads and railroads all across northern Japan. To make matters worse, considerable damage occurred at the Fukushima Daiichi and Daini nuclear power plants on the coast of Fukushima. Power was lost, and emergency backup generators, fueled by diesel fuel, were destroyed by floodwaters. Let's sidestep for a moment and take a minute to talk about how modern nuclear reactors actually work. I'm not a nuclear physicist, so this might be overly general or otherwise outright wrong. If it is, please let me know. As an aside, there's a miniseries on HBO called Chernobyl, about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster in 1986. In this miniseries, Jared Harris, a favorite actor of mine, gives a monologue in a later episode when he's testifying to the government on how the Chernobyl disaster actually happened. In the monologue, he explains in very elementary terms how an RBMK reactor works. This is an extremely well-presented summary of how nuclear energy generally works, and I highly recommend that monologue and that show in general to learn more about this topic. The Fukushima Daiichi reactors were not RBMK, like the ones in Chernobyl, but the basis of nuclear energy production remains the same. Back to the Fukushima plant. The Fukushima plant ran 6 boiling water reactors. These reactors produce energy by harnessing a very slow nuclear reaction that produces a great deal of heat, which is used to boil water, create steam, and turn turbines. The reaction occurs when uranium decays or splits apart in a process that fires off neutrons and heat. When these neutrons hit other uranium atoms, those atoms also split, releasing neutrons and heat, and on the reaction goes. The reactivity of uranium fuel increases ad infinitum without regulation. All nuclear reactors are closed systems so that the temperature and pressure and the contents of that system can be tightly controlled. In that closed system, the reactivity of the uranium fuel can be controlled in a variety of ways. One way is to insert control rods. These rods act like the brakes on the reaction, and they were made of non-reactive boron metal in the case of Chernobyl. In short, they create a physical and chemical barrier that prevents the neutrons and heat from splitting uranium atoms from causing other uranium atoms to split and release heat. Another brake is water. Water removes heat, but at the cost of creating steam. In a closed system, this increases pressure buildup of irradiated water vapor. If you remember from high school chemistry class, as pressure increases, so too does reactivity of a given chemical reaction. So the excessive buildup of steam can be dangerous as well. However, this buildup is prevented when the pressure of the steam is vented off to turn turbines and create electricity. However, we should note that unlike high school chemistry, increased heat actually reduces the reactivity of uranium fuel. Thus, the closed system reaction can be regulated by managing the temperature. As you can see, it's all a delicate balance. Heat has to be harnessed for energy before the reaction goes out of control or before it snuffs itself out from heating up too much. If things weren't complicated enough, we should also note that the product of the uranium reaction is our noble gas friend xenon. It's not noble because it's born of an aristocratic family, it's noble because it is completely inert. If xenon builds up, a reaction can be quote-unquote poisoned. Again, high school chemistry. Reactivity slows in a closed system if there's an excessive buildup of the product of that reaction, especially when that product prevents further reactivity. Thus, poisoning is another possible emergency exit strategy by which you can break up the nuclear reaction, by means of flooding it with an inert or non-reactive material such as xenon. This is a very delicate reaction and a very delicate environment to maintain. When cooling fails, heat and pressure increases, causing explosions of potentially radioactive material. When control rods fail, the reaction rate increases, causing heat to increase and explosions to occur. When poisoning fails, the reaction rate increases, heat and pressure increase, and then explosions. At Fukushima Daiichi, the tsunami washed over the seawalls of the plant and took out the diesel backup generators whose purpose was to cool the reactors by pumping water through the system. Of the 6 reactors, 1 through 5 lost AC power, and DC power was lost in units 1, 2, and 4. Reactor 6 actually remained online. Without cooling capabilities, heat and pressure inside of the reactors began to increase, to say nothing of the damage that the flooding had already caused. So, there was a buildup of a bunch of irradiated water and debris against a compromised structure. Thus, there was a bunch of radioactive material everywhere, and there were boiling reactors about to explode and spew their spent and unspent fuel everywhere. As soon as it was learned that cooling had failed, TEPCO, the owner and operator of the plant, declared a first-level nuclear emergency. Now, let's introduce Tokyo Denryoku Holdings Kabushiki Gaisha, aka the Tokyo Electric Power Company, known as TEPCO. This is the public utility company servicing electricity to the entire Kanto region, or the plain in and around Tokyo. TEPCO at the time drew its power from 3 nuclear plants in the northern regions of Japan, the second most productive of these being the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, which produced 4,696 megawatts of electricity for the Kanto region. Now you may be wondering, how is it that in post-war Japan there was any sentiment at all to build nuclear power plants to fuel the country? The answer is that in the 1960s and 70s, nuclear power enjoyed a boom all over the world. People were constructing plants at an incredibly high rate. It was thought that we had finally solved the energy crisis by harnessing atomic power. This boom also reached Japan. TEPCO and General Electric coordinated to construct nuclear power plants all over Japan in the 60s and 70s. Even though public opinion was still a little apprehensive with regards to nuclear stuff after World War II, the US and other international powers ran many marketing campaigns to win over public opinion, and it genuinely worked. So, the Fukushima power plant was constructed in 1970. When concerned people spoke out that these areas were known to be earthquake-prone, TEPCO and General Electric responded by saying that these reactors were incredibly safe in design, and no earthquake or other natural disaster could ever cause the plant to fail or go into meltdown. This was known at the time to be at least a partial lie told to the Japanese public. This was the nuclear energy equivalent of saying that the Titanic was unsinkable. However, although this was a partial lie and a marketing campaign told to the Japanese public, they also could not have anticipated an earthquake as strong as the Great East Japan earthquake in 2011. This earthquake and the resultant tsunami was worse than most people could have ever expected or accounted for. However, the Fukushima coast, known as the Sanriku coast, has been a known hotbed of earthquake and tsunami activity in general for millennia, due to the convergence of 3 tectonic plates just off the coast, and due to several dozen irregularly shaped bays along the coastline which amplified tsunami activity. There was even a long and recorded history of severe earthquakes and tsunamis in this region. If we look at it historically, we can see that the Fukushima earthquake and the tsunami of 2011 actually followed very similar mechanisms to the Sanriku earthquakes and tsunamis of the years 869, 1896, and 1933. So while the magnitude of the destruction and the strength of the earthquake were unprecedented, the mechanism and the danger absolutely was. To make matters worse, after the construction of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant, TEPCO falsified a bunch of safety and inspection data on the Fukushima reactors in the years after. They admitted in 2002 to failing to report damages to their reactors and falsifying safety reports all throughout the 80s and 90s, even as Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island were occurring in Russia and the US respectively. In 2008, the International Atomic Energy Agency warned TEPCO and the Japanese government that the Fukushima plant was built using outdated safety guidelines, had not been updated to be brought up to code, and could be a serious problem during a large earthquake. Then, on February 28, 2011, 2 weeks prior to the earthquake, TEPCO submitted a report to the Japanese Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, further admitting that the company had previously submitted fake inspection and repair reports on their nuclear plants. The report revealed that TEPCO failed to inspect more than 30 technical components of the 6 reactors in Fukushima, as well as many other components of many other reactors across Japan. They admitted to failing to inspect power boards for the reactor's temperature control valves. They failed to inspect cooling systems, and they failed to inspect emergency power diesel generators. So, 3 of the reactors at Fukushima Daiichi went into possible meltdown, and a 2-kilometer radius evacuation of 1,900 residents was ordered by local authorities at 2050 Japan Standard Time, March 11th. However, there was a communication breakdown between local and national authorities, and so at the very same time, a 3-kilometer evacuation order of around 6,000 residents and a 10-kilometer shelter-in-place order for about 45,000 residents was established at 2123. The evacuation radius was expanded to 10 kilometers at 5:44 in the morning, and was then revised to 20 kilometers at 6:25 the next day. The size of these evacuation zones was set completely arbitrarily at the discretion of the government and TEPCO bureaucrats, with no consultation with experts on nuclear power or people in the know about the events unfolding at the plant. Due to the overlapping evacuation and conflicting evacuate versus shelter-in-place orders, many residents had evacuated to areas which would minutes later be designated as areas to evacuate from themselves. This resulted in many people having to move further and further away multiple times until they reached an area outside the final 20-kilometer evacuation zone. As many as 20% of the residents who were within the initial 2-kilometer radius had to evacuate more than 6 times to keep up with the new and incoming orders. During the event, TEPCO employees were instructed never to use the phrase core meltdown, either in public or in private. This could have been to prevent panic in the absence of all available information, but it was also absolutely to downplay the extent of the failure of the Fukushima plant. The term core meltdown is a little complicated. The International Atomic Energy Agency has actually never given a hard-line definition of the term, but it more or less refers to when the heat from an uncontrolled nuclear reaction causes the fuel rods themselves, the uranium fuel, to melt. Uranium fuel is stored as a solid metal, and we've already discussed the role that heat plays in the process of producing nuclear energy. So whenever there is a meltdown, what was once an incredibly radioactive solid is now an incredibly radioactive white-hot liquid, and this is incredibly dangerous. We've talked about how the heat could damage the infrastructure around the reactor core, causing it to ignite or collapse, or it could cause buildups in pressure that lead to explosions and the mass dispersion of white-hot irradiated liquid uranium. Meltdown is further a tricky term because there's no way to confirm that a core meltdown has happened until somebody enters the core, either during or after the event. Thus, TEPCO was within bounds not to use that term because nobody had been inside the reactors to see the core. But in terms of emergency response, there were, as I said, multiple explosions in 3 reactors at the plant. Regardless of if there was a confirmed core meltdown, emergency services and the public probably should have been induced to respond as if there was one. As we discussed, there was clearly a breakdown in communication from the plant to TEPCO to the local government to the provincial government to the national government and then back to emergency services, the media, and the public. So, coolant failed across the board, and all power was lost to 3 out of 6 reactors. We'll go reactor by reactor and describe what happened in each one. For context, when the earthquake and tsunami hit, reactors 4, 5, and 6 were already shut down, and 1 through 3 were operating as normal. When the earthquake hit, 1 through 3 began automatic shutdown procedures, but the tsunami and loss of power resulted in several complications. In Reactor 1, once loss of coolant was confirmed, operators attempted to start venting pressure and heat by finding ways to open valves all over the reactor without power, and by finding ways to inject cooling water using fire protection systems. This is per standard emergency cooling shutdown procedure. However, a few factors prevented this, and the operators didn't know about these factors until they tried to enact these measures. One factor was that pressure was already too high within the core to accommodate water injection for cooling. When pressure in a system is too high, you can't inject water into it without that water blowing back at you, or otherwise changing phase and turning into water vapor immediately. This was a problem because radioactivity and reactivity of the nuclear reaction had already increased a great deal. So, we were building up to a recipe for an explosion. Any fire protection system would have immediately changed phase, it would have increased the pressure in the system, and it would have caused more problems than it solved. So instead of cooling, now the next decision to make was about venting pressure. In a closed system, thermodynamics teaches us that pressure and heat are proportional to each other. As one increases, so does the other. So as a secondary method of cooling the area, or making it at least able to be cooled further with water, pressure must be safely vented somehow. However, the operators then found that most, if not all, of the pressure release valves for venting were inoperable due to the loss of power, and it was too dangerous to send people in there to engage them manually. They were eventually able to restore power, get the valves online to vent pressure, and even get some water into the system, but there was nevertheless a hydrogen explosion in the secondary confinement structure of Reactor 1 on March 12th at 1536. This explosion severely damaged the lines that were used to pipe water in and out for cooling. Later, it was confirmed that fuel in Reactor 1 had indeed melted down and melted into the concrete pad below the containment vessels. Reactor 1 was the most damaged out of the 6, and many speculate that the melted fuel came within 30 centimeters or 12 inches of melting through the concrete pad and seeping into the ground below, which would have been a massive environmental disaster. However, we can't know how true this claim is without taking everything apart, which is ongoing, but is going to take years or even decades, given that the site is still strongly irradiated and is dangerous for people to enter into. Reactor 2 was functioning when it lost all power, but there was enough of a gap between the automatic shutdown beginning and the loss of power that pressure and heat did not build up enough to cause a meltdown of the fuel that the reactor contained. Furthermore, Reactor 2 didn't sustain so much damage that it had an explosion or anything like that. The operators assumed loss of coolant just like in Reactor 1 and treated it the exact same way during the power outage because they had no way to know what was going on inside containment. However, it did eventually deplete its cooling water supply, and so plans were made to inject seawater into the system to continue cooling it while efforts were focused on mitigating the damage on Reactor 1. However, these efforts were stymied by an explosion in Reactor 3, which we'll talk about in a moment. Thus, in Reactor 2, being sort of ignored because Reactors 1 and 3 were in active crisis, pressure and heat built up, and on March 15th, it was suspected that containment failure had occurred, which basically meant that radioactive material was outside of the core containment systems and posed a radiation hazard. So, everybody was evacuated from the site. In Reactor 3, there was still some power, and fuel cooling continued as normal for a couple of days after the earthquake and tsunami. The backup diesel generators had not been completely destroyed for this reactor. However, without grid power, or power from a source that isn't a battery or an on-site generator, the main cooling eventually did fail. Emergency backups kicked in an attempt to cool the reactor while operators figured out what to do next. They attempted to restart several systems for cooling and to inject fire protection water and seawater, but no option proved viable due to a number of malfunctions and conditions. Pressure and heat began to build. At 9:08 on March 13th, they were able to actually successfully vent some of the pressure from this reactor using car batteries that they had gotten from abandoned cars nearby. They wired them together, and they used that power to operate these mechanical vents. This allowed them to at least get pressure down to levels where cooling using seawater would work. Despite being cooled, pressure in the primary containment vessel continued to rise, and the coolant water level continued to drop until the fuel became uncovered on the morning of the 14th at 6:20 a.m. This caused workers to evacuate, fearing a hydrogen explosion like in Reactor 1. At 11:01 on March 14th, there was indeed a much larger hydrogen explosion, which delayed cooling in Reactors 1 and 3 both. Then, on March 15th, the full evacuation of Fukushima Daiichi was ordered. Reactor 4 was not operating at the time and didn't contain fuel, but it did have spent fuel rods in a common spent fuel pool. Spent nuclear fuel is just as dangerous as unspent fuel, just in different ways. When uranium degrades by releasing neutrons and heat, the atom structure changes, and the atom itself becomes a different element. You may remember from chemistry class that different elements are defined by the number of protons and neutrons contained in the nucleus of the atom. When neutrons are ejected, the element changes, and this is the process of radioactive decay. Uranium-238, the main nuclear fuel in nuclear power plants, degrades into radioactive nuclides of equally toxic and dangerous elements, such as thorium, polonium, radium, and thallium. The final product of this decay, which is the subject of all discussions of nuclear waste disposal, is radioactive lead. Nuclear waste is never a single homogeneous element. You may have a mixture of lead, thorium, thallium, radium, etc., but all of it is still radioactive. Thus, it poses quite an environmental threat. So, after explosions at reactors 1 and 3, the number 4 site was evacuated on March 15th when the whole nuclear plant was evacuated. During evacuation, there was an explosion at reactor 4 as well. Some speculate that this was due to shared hydrogen pipelines with reactor 3. This also dispersed a bunch of radioactive material, which is very bad. However, the spent fuel pool was safe, so luckily it wasn't as bad as it could have been. Reactor 5 was also not operating at the time of the earthquake or tsunami, but was fueled to undergo pressure tests at the time. Although it lost power and operability of some systems, the water in the containment vessels kept it cool, and it was the first of all 6 reactors to achieve a cold shutdown on the afternoon of March 20th. This is where it's cooled until being inert enough to start decommissioning it, and this is what operators had attempted to achieve with the other reactors. Reactor 6 was not operating and was also very near to a cool shutdown. It also maintained some power, so it achieved cool shutdown an hour after Reactor 5. This whole event, with its several hydrogen explosions, resulted in huge amounts of radioactive discharge into the air, the ground, and the sea. Around 100 miles of Japan's coastline, with Fukushima Daiichi in the center, recorded increased radiation levels. Furthermore, much of the hinterland and into the interior of the region, stretching even as far south as northern Tokyo, recorded increased radiation. In order to try and ameliorate the real and perceived threat of the radioactivity, the government ordered decontamination down to levels of radiation that fell far below the human health threshold. TEPCO was ordered to remove all fuel materials from the site. As of February 2021, they have removed 1,535 fuel assemblies from the common reactor spent fuel pool and 566 fuel assemblies from the reactor 3 spent fuel pool. They plan to remove all fuel rods from the spent fuel pools of units 1, 2, 5, and 6 by 2031, and to remove the remaining molten fuel debris from the reactor containments of unit 1, 2, and 3 by 2040 or 2050. Plant management estimated the ongoing intensive cleanup program to both decontaminate affected areas and decommission the plant will take 30 to 40 years from the accident. Due to evacuations, radiation damage, and damage from the earthquake and tsunami, as many as 164,000 people were displaced. There were studies conducted that showed that the amount of times one had to evacuate and the amount of time one had to spend evacuated were both inversely proportional to mental health and wellness. The more times one evacuated and the longer they spent evacuated, the worse off their mental health was. The trauma of the event itself and the displacement it caused expressed in many, many different ways. As an example, in the months after March of 2011, several taxi drivers in the coastal town of Ishinomaki, where 6,000 people had died from the tsunami, reported stopping and picking up many people who would ask for a destination inside of the tsunami zone, only to disappear and vanish from their back seats in the middle of the ride before they even arrived into the zone. Stories like this popped up all over the east coast of Japan, in cities like Sendai and Onagawa. Other kinds of reports came up as well. Some people reported seeing people that they knew to be dead lining up at shelters or relief stations. Buddhist monks and Shinto priests were called to exorcise and purify sites where homes and families had been destroyed. Some people reported seeing wet footprints in the ground leading to nowhere, even on a dry day. I leave it up to you to decide if these stories actually happened or if they were hallucinations induced by grief and trauma, or if they're stories to kind of narrativize what had happened in 2011. However, at the same time, I would be remiss not to mention the international aid and relief efforts that took place after the tsunami and earthquake as well. At 1800, on March 11th, the Foreign Ministry of Japan communicated to the Japanese public and to the international community that it had, within hours of the earthquake and tsunami occurring, requested 8 countries to send relief teams to help. These teams came from South Korea, Singapore, Germany, Switzerland, the United States, China, the United Kingdom, and New Zealand. Later, the Japanese government also requested the activation of the International Charter on Space and Major Disasters, whose main function was to take detailed satellite imagery, which would then be circulated and shared with rescue and aid organizations, both domestic and foreign. 54 national governments, including from the aforementioned 8 countries, contributed to the relief efforts in some way. Even North Korea, a country that Japan has generally had poor relations with since the Korean War, donated relief money. Many corporations, individuals, and non-government aid organizations also donated money, supplies, resources, people to the rescue, aid, and relief efforts. This was an incredibly rare and beautiful moment where the whole world really pitched in to help those affected by the disaster, despite poor political relations, despite distance, or despite even a lack of resources. Even the Maldives, the smallest sovereign country in Asia, with a population of only 500,000, donated 90,000 cans of tuna to help feed people. Once most of the aftermath had passed, the nuclear accident component of the disaster led to significant changes in Japanese energy policy. Before the accident, 25% of Japan's power was nuclear, with plans to increase up to 50%. After the accident, nuclear power became less than 1% of Japanese power production. All nuclear reactors in the whole country were shut down by 2013. In the subsequent elections, nuclear power was a huge hot-button issue. Shinzo Abe was a proponent of nuclear power before the disaster, but he was advised to change his stance after the accident, leading to a very strong victory for his party, the Liberal Democratic Party. There was some talk about restarting nuclear reactors after the accident, but when these talks started, a huge 30,000-person protest occurred in Tokyo to stop this plan, and it was eventually discarded. Since then, the amount of power produced by nuclear has been replaced almost entirely by fossil fuels, forcing Japan to go back on emission reduction initiatives and climate goals that it had previously made. One of the biggest hot-button issues to crop up since the accident is the release of contaminated water into the Pacific Ocean. Seawater was used to cool melting or melted down reactors, if you remember from reactors 1, 3, and 4. Once the water was used for this cooling purpose, it had become irradiated and contaminated with these radionuclides that we mentioned earlier. You can't ever fully unirradiate used cooling water, so it's quite a hot potato. The longer it sits, the more radiation it releases. You can treat it somewhat effectively for the worst of the radionuclides, but there comes a point where you have to do something with it. On 5th April 2011, TEPCO discharged 11,500 tons of completely untreated radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean in order to free up storage space for water that was even more radioactive. These 11,500 gallons had been used for cooling the reactor cores in the immediate nuclear emergency, and while the water was the least radioactively contaminated among the various stores of irradiated water, it was still 100 times above the legal limit for discharging into the ocean. Furthermore, TEPCO estimated that a total of 520,000 tons of untreated radioactive water had escaped into the ocean during the incident before further spillage could be contained. The Pacific Ocean's very strong currents, of course, have diluted this radioactive water so that no one spot in the ocean is so irradiated that it poses a health hazard to go there on a boat, or to dive there, or even eat fish from there. But there was still a considerable environmental effect to all of this happening. Fish, water, and plants saw increased radioactivity levels all over the northern Pacific after this release. The impact, however, doesn't stop there. A constant supply of water needs to be used to cool the reactors, which still have dangerous levels of decay heat, and so more and more water is being irradiated every day. TEPCO created a new water treatment system to remove the worst of the radionuclides from the water, which would make it come below the minimum legal limit of radioactivity for release back into the ocean. But this system isn't perfect, and radiation isn't the only metric which is to be considered when releasing water back into the ocean. As an example, even if the radioactivity is below a certain level, the water will still absolutely be contaminated with heavy metals like thallium, lead, and others. Regardless, overall, I think that these efforts are mostly effective in treating the water. I'll leave it up to you if you think I mean that in a glass half full or glass half empty way. One way or the other, treated water has continued to be released into the ocean up to this day, with the most recent release beginning in August 2023 and continuing up to now. This water is again within the limitations for used cooling water that's been irradiated, but despite protests from other areas of Japan and Japan's neighbors, such as Korea, Russia, and China, they've proceeded with the release. Many in the Japanese public and in the international community at large were naturally very hesitant to allow Japan to release treated radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean. The ocean is where much of Japan's food supply comes from, and the effects of irradiating the ocean, even if it is a tiny amount of irradiation, are more or less unknown at this stage. The Japanese public also felt that other measures, like burying the water in sealed containers, were not ever really considered due to the cost. And they also suspected that the government and TEPCO just went with the easiest and cheapest option at the risk of the health of everybody on the Pacific Ocean. Many UN member nations condemned the release of water into the Pacific because they cited that the people of Fukushima had a human right not to be willingly exposed to radioactive wastewater. Many scientific panels and groups also critiqued the plan, saying that it was not thoroughly researched enough to be called safe for the people, the ocean, or the environment at large. In South Korea and China, people rushed to buy up salt and other sea products prior to the expected release of the treated discharge, because sea salt is produced on the coast of the sea, and there were concerns that the salt would be irradiated after the release happened. Protests against the action popped up all over East Asia, opposing the release, and Greenpeace and other environmental conservation groups wrote press releases opposing the plan. Some uneducated leaders in the West supported the plan on the grounds of maintaining good political and economic relations with Japan, but they were far in the minority. Still, the plan went ahead, and we'll have to see what the results are as they develop. After the nuclear accident, several investigations were conducted to figure out exactly what happened and why. One such investigation was conducted by the Tokyo Denryoku Fukushima Genshi Ryoku Hatsuden Shō Jiko Chosa Iinkai, or the National Diet of Japan Fukushima Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation Commission. This was the first ever independent investigatory commission created by the Japanese government in its 66 years of constitutional governance. Their investigation concluded that the accident was entirely preventable. The commission's reports accused the government and TEPCO of lacking a sense of responsibility for protecting society by maintaining safety standards in the course of running nuclear power. They argued that the nation had a right to safety from nuclear accidents and that TEPCO and the government had violated that. The reasons for this violation, they argued, were due to what they called, quote, particularly Japanese characteristics, such as obedience, reluctance to question authority, and groupism, unquote. In other words, they blamed what they viewed to be inherent or intrinsic characteristics of Japanese culture, particularly social hierarchy and following orders in the workplace. I think that this is one of those cases where they did the math all wrong and they still got the right answer. Did the government and TEPCO betray the Japanese people? Absolutely. Remember all those safety violations I mentioned before? However, was the reason they did all of that because Japanese people are inherently obedient to authority and groupist rather than individualist? That's a much more subjective and problematic claim to make. I think that TEPCO, a corporation, lied about their safety standards to save money and protect profits and save face in public opinion. Corporations all over the world do that all the time. That's not an inherently Japanese thing to do at all. A second investigation was conducted by the Tokyo Denryoku Fukushima Genshi Ryoku Hatsudensho ni Okeru Jiko Chosa Kensho Iinkai, or the Investigation Committee on the Accident at the Fukushima Nuclear Power Stations. This was a government-appointed panel of scholars, journalists, lawyers, and engineers, and their purpose was to identify the accident's causes and propose policies designed to minimize the damage and prevent the recurrence of similar incidents. This panel's report placed much more blame on a failure of nuclear crisis management preparedness, evidenced by the conflicting evacuation orders and the breakdowns of communication between all levels of government and TEPCO. This is a much less subjective and problematic claim to make. Another investigation by the New York Times argued that a Japanese hiring practice called amakudari, or descent from heaven, was partially to blame. This is a phenomenon where Japanese senior bureaucrats retire to high-profile positions in the private and public sectors. This opens the door for all kinds of corruption. For example, the Minister of Energy may make policies that favor a particular energy company, and then he may get a job at that particular company when he decides to retire from his public sector job. As a result, the argument is essentially that the very highest levels of authority at TEPCO and in the government were all buddy-buddy with each other, and they were all underqualified for the jobs they had. These investigations altogether concluded that regulatory capture, nepotism, and greed were to blame for the accident, which makes much more sense than arguing that it had anything to do with Japanese people or culture in particular. In August of 2011, several top energy officials were fired by the Japanese government, including the Vice Minister for Economy, Trade, and Industry, the head of the Nuclear and Industrial Safety Agency, and the head of the Agency for Natural Resources and Energy. Later, in 2016, 3 former TEPCO executives, Chairman Tsunehisa Katsumata, and 2 vice presidents, were indicted for negligence resulting in death and injury and went to trial over it. However, they pleaded not guilty and were acquitted in September 2019. For reference, in Japanese law, 99% of indictments lead to convictions and jail time, and yet these 3 walked free. I'll leave it to you to decide as to how or why that happened. After the disaster, the president of TEPCO, Masataka Shimizu, was hospitalized with symptoms of dizziness and high blood pressure. This was likely due to an overload of stress from the disaster and what it meant for the company. Things were looking increasingly bad for the Fukushima plant, and the radiation was spreading and getting worse, and the media was already starting to report on TEPCO's possible imminent nationalization or bankruptcy. His panic and fears came true, and in 2012, TEPCO was fully nationalized, with the Japanese government buying up 50.11% of the shares of the company, giving them the majority vote on all decisions. Now we're into the takeaway section of the episode. For the remainder of the episode, we'll be talking about sentiment regarding denuclearization in Japan in the years since World War II. This is an incredibly sensitive topic because Japanese people are uniquely affected by the power of nuclear energy. Of course, there were the nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II, and then there was this 3/11 disaster less than 100 years later. Those are just the ones that occurred in Japan. We should also remember that they would be aware of the 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and other nuclear accidents and disasters that have occurred in the last century. After the war, there was a very strong denuclearization sentiment in Japan. One might even call it a trauma or a fear of all things nuclear. This justified fear and trauma was expressed by popular media such as Godzilla, Barefoot Gen, and more. However, as I mentioned, sentiment did begin to shift in the 60s and 70s when the potential for nuclear power to solve the energy crisis entered public knowledge. Then, opinions became much more complicated. While most people were still in favor of denuclearization in a military context, there were still people who began to turn in favor of building nuclear power plants. There were, of course, many holdouts who protested their construction, but much of the Japanese public came around to nuclear power in the 60s and 70s. This led to the construction of dozens of reactors all over the country, leading to that 25% figure I quoted earlier. The rest we've discussed, and now there's been a huge swing back to being against nuclear power. The accident, as I told you, resulted in the shutting down of all nuclear reactors across Japan. However, in the 2020s, sentiment may be swinging back in the other direction. In December of 2022, the government adopted a plan to extend the lifespan of nuclear reactors, replace old ones, and even build new ones. So instead of decommissioning and repurposing old shut-down nuclear reactors to be plants for fossil fuels or for something else, they're actually planning on keeping them renovated and up to code, even if they're not being turned on at this time. And the government is also potentially planning to build new plants as well. Under the new policy, NPR reports that Japan plans to maximize the use of existing reactors by restarting as many of them as possible and prolonging the operating life of aging ones beyond their 60-year limit. The government also pledged to devote resources to developing next-generation reactors which are safer, run cleaner, and have a longer lifespan. They even committed to making 20 to 22% of Japanese energy come from nuclear by 2030. A complete reversal on the plan they had previously made to fully decommission and phase out all nuclear power by the same year. This has been met with mixed reception by the Japanese public, but due to rising fossil fuel costs and the pressure to commit to shifting away from fossil fuel dependency for the sake of the climate, they're left with little choice. Only time will tell how the aftermath of the disaster plays out and if Japan will ever return to nuclear power. However, as of now, it looks like they will. My personal opinion is that on paper, nuclear power is absolutely the cleanest, safest, and most efficient power source known to mankind. However, that's never been reflected in the real world for tons of various reasons, including human greed, short-sightedness, and a lack of education and resources. Nevertheless, even in the midst of nuclear disasters and historic levels of fossil fuel dependency, nuclear scientists and regulators continue to make nuclear power safer, more efficient, and more viable, both on paper and in real life. So there may come a day when it's actually the best option. As I mentioned, waste disposal is always the hot talking point with nuclear energy. People are always saying, we don't want nuclear waste poisoning our air and our soil and our water. And I get that. But we can't sit here pretending that fossil fuels aren't doing that already on a scale that is exponentially more dangerous and deadly than any amount of nuclear waste ever did or ever could. Furthermore, if nuclear energy had enough support and resources from the general public, we could undoubtedly be able to come up with a safe and sustainable solution to handling the toxic waste. However, that's just my uninformed opinion on things. Take it or leave it. This concludes our discussion of the 3/11 disaster. Thank you for listening to Nihonshi, a Japanese history podcast. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you very much, and see you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.